Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Uncanny Oddities. This is Season 3, Episode 4, and we are going to be talking about the Garden of Eden. Now, as most of you are probably very well aware, brief synopsis, it is the paradise garden planted by God for the first humans, Adam and Eve. It was lush, abundant, and a place of innocence and harmony where everything was all peaceful, nobody got into fights, and it was basically world peace. Now, there were some interesting things as well. A river flows out of Eden and splits into four, known as Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. Now, what stands out to me, well, you already know the humans were expelled after eating the apple of knowledge, marking what is known as the fall. So, before we go any further, I wanted to get a little bit deeper into this section where it talks about the four rivers that flow out of Eden. Now, two of them, Pishon and Gihon, I've never heard of. However, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, I have heard of those. And those rivers actually do exist in the modern day world. So that's something interesting to take note of right there. If the Garden of Eden was a purely mythological, fictional land, then why are the Euphrates and Tigris rivers actually real rivers? And yeah, they could have used, some real river names in the story, whatever. Interesting enough. I'll accept that. But I just wanted to point that out because it's very interesting to me because a lot of the stuff people automatically just assume that it doesn't work, it's not real, and, things like science and religion can't coexist. But I truly, after what I've studied, I truly believe that they can. Not only can they coexist, but if you go deep enough into either of them, they lead to the other one. So that's just like a brief little rundown of the main idea of the Garden of Eden. Now, the big point that happened is the fall. When we talk about the fall, when he ate the apple, when Adam ate the apple, as he was convinced to do so by Lucifer or Sophia or whoever, depending on your personal belief system. There are a few different variations on that. But for this particular effort tonight, we're going to go ahead and go with the basic Christian telling of it, which says that Lucifer, disguised as a snake, entered the Garden of Eden and told Adam to eat from the tree of knowledge. So that is what was known as the fall. When Adam ate from the tree of knowledge, God came around and God was very upset. And he was like, Adam, where are you? I'm going to get back to that one here in a little bit. But he was asking where Adam was. And then he found out that he ate from the tree of knowledge. And he was like, hey, dude, that was the one thing that I told you can't do. I told you not to eat from that tree of knowledge. But whatever. So he kicked him out of heaven. Eden, not heaven necessarily, but the Garden of Eden, which was a garden in heaven. You get the point. So the next part I wanted to discuss was some Mesopotamian parallels that kind of struck a chord with me. The Sumerians believe in something known as a Garden of the Gods, which was a paradise like garden associated with divine beings and sources of rivers. Sounds kind of like their version of the Garden of Eden. And of course, we have flood myths and creation tales from Eridu and other Sumerian city garden traditions that feature idyllic beginnings. So, what if there truly was some sort of Garden of Eden? Maybe there really was a Garden of Eden of some sort, and all these stories across all these different religions and cultures and belief systems were discussing the same general concept. That's what I've come to realize since I've started studying religions a little bit more and studying them in conjunction with science, I've come to the realization that a lot of these religions are telling the same basic generalized stories, just with different names and slightly altered events. But it's the same basic premise, the same basic story in the same basic place. And that's really been interesting to me lately as I've started studying this stuff. How can they all speak of the same thing and the same story, just with different cultural names and slight variations based on their belief systems? But how can they come up with such similar beliefs and stories unless there was some sort of small truth hidden in there somewhere? So that's always been really interesting to me, and one of my, I guess, rabbit holes that I go down when studying religion is trying to piece all these stories together from all these different religions and look at the little different, like, I think they're called like idiosyncrasies, all the little things that are just slightly different. So it's possible that it could have been the original birthplace of humanity as a species. If you strip away all the religion and just leave science, there had to be some sort of birthplace for modern man, for modern humanity, mankind, whatever. Now, there are some other symbolic and metaphorical interpretations that I have discovered. Some people believe that the Garden of Eden could potentially be a symbol of primordial wholeness, or simply a representation of the state of unity within all of humanity. Like, and like pre-consciousness, if anyone knows anything about that, that's a whole other topic for a whole other time. I'm not going to get into that too deeply. But some people believe the Garden of Eden may have represented pre-consciousness before people became conscious. And once we became conscious, that was the fall, when we separated and gained our own identities as individuals and left the source of everything, which some people may interpret as God or the Garden of Eden being the place where God had intended for man to be at initially. There's a few different ways to interpret that. And I'm not trying to tell you how to believe. I'm just offering some interesting things that I personally find interesting from different belief systems and cultures around the world. Now, my personal favorite, because, even trying to be unbiased, and just inform people, you're always going to have your personal favorite, right? So my personal favorite is, some people, Gnostics in particular, believe that the Garden of Eden was an allegory of human awakening. It was a myth about self-awareness, and the fall was symbolic of humanity's entry into differentiating knowledge, morality, and responsibility, which is basically just like our consciousness and our recognition of right and wrong. And maybe the Garden of Eden was not even a real place, but maybe the apple that we ate, that Adam ate from, perhaps it was a symbol meant to represent knowledge. Obviously, that much is pretty obvious for everyone, I would hope, the apple representing knowledge. But maybe it wasn't just knowledge. Maybe there was more to it than that. Maybe the apple was representative of freedom and separation from the whole. Maybe the apple could have been representative of the knowledge of individuality and what it means to be an individual and break apart from the collective and go out on your own. And that's my personal favorite interpretation. Now, another popular interpretation is it could be considered a mythic boundary space. Now, what that means is some people believe that Eden exists on what they call the eastern horizon, And that is supposedly a symbolic frontier beyond ordinary human life, not fully accessible to the ordinary world. Kind of like the spirit world or the afterlife, something like that. Now, there is a unique place in world mythology with Eden. Every ancient culture, well, almost every ancient culture, has some sort of garden where it all started at. Whether it's the Garden of Eden, which we've been discussing here, Greek mythology has something known as the Garden of the Hesperides, a paradise orchard of divine fruit. And that also reminds me of this story where someone was asked to watch fruit, and they said that this fruit, it was the nectar of the gods, and they said that the fruit would make you immortal. However, you had to take care of the fruit. You had to watch it every day, and you had to, make sure you watered the fruit. You had to make sure it got plenty of sun, and all these different rules that you had to make sure that you took proper care of the fruit. But so long as you maintained proper care of the fruit, they said that you would be invincible. Not, well, let me rephrase that. Not invincible, but immortal. They said you would live forever so long as you weren't attacked or assaulted or whatever, you would live a long natural life. And so what ended up happening is the person who was in charge of, taking care of those fruit, obviously, eventually stopped taking care of them. And, well, you can guess it didn't end too well for them. So that kind of reminds me of that with the Greek garden. Then they also, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they had a quest to find a remote garden of life. Like the Fountain of Youth is also very popular in these kinds of stories. Now, most oral traditions have what are known as Golden Age myths, where early humanity lived in harmony before loss, such as, like back during, one of my favorite time periods was the Lemurians and the Atlanteans. The Lemurians were very peaceful people. They had large portions of land, and it was basically the Lemurians and the Atlanteans. They were like the only two cultures at the time because the Lemurians knew how to be peaceful. They were like, look, at the end of the day, regardless of anything else, we're all humans. So, why do we need to fight each other? We're all the same species, and we'll accomplish a lot more by working together than we ever will by fighting each other. But I'm going to get on a rant, so I'll stop it there. But I thought they were one of the most interesting ones, and they could live in harmony, and that is just very beautiful to me, where people can just let go of their differences in ideals, opinions, cultures, and beliefs, and everything else, and just live peacefully together. It sounds like a beautiful thing to me, and I can definitely appreciate the idea of humanity living in harmony. Now, these different ideas suggest that Eden could have been something as a cross-cultural archetype. Like basically there was a little bit of, this culture there, a little bit of that culture there, and then over time as people gained more and more individuality, they kind of left the garden and went off to form their own cultures and their own little societies and stuff. I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Is maybe the Garden of Eden, or whatever you call it in your personal culture and belief system, maybe it was a real place, and maybe it was a place where humanity actually originated from. And when they did, maybe they started to gain individuality, they had their own thoughts, and they didn't agree with each other. So they all went out and formed their own little groups and societies where they got to make their own rules. Kind of like states and, cities and towns and stuff like that. Like the United States of America. They call us states and they call it America, and they say they're united, but the very act of making a state is an act of division, which I never really understood, but, whatever. We're not trying to get into all that. I'm just using it as a reference point that at one point in time, I feel like we were more unified as a culture, as a people. We didn't have all these little sections here and there and everywhere else. like I mentioned earlier with the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, but also Pangea. There used to be a massive landmass before we had all these continents. And it's just interesting to think about the idea of people being peaceful. I don't know. It's just interesting to me to think that that could actually be a possibility. But I guess our real question is, with all this information, was Eden actually a lost civilization? And I'm going to say, well, obviously the mainstream says that it clearly was not, but regardless of whether it was called Eden or something else, there had to be some sort of origin place where the first humans were at. Call it Pangea, call it Eden, call it whatever you want, but something had to exist where humanity originated at. And I think that that would be very interesting to, try to work towards, maybe. Like if we could work together and unify and try to work towards a peaceful era where everyone can coexist and live despite differences in ideas, opinions, and everything else. And those are my thoughts on the Garden of Eden as a lost civilization and whether or not it might have actually been real. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter whether Eden was real or not, because at one point in time, humanity was united. And one day, I would like to see us get back to that point. And as we always say around here, stay uncanny. Thank you. We will see you next time.